So what I want to do is put together a little bit of an idea toward being able to talk theologically about media and technology, because there's all kinds of fun things out there and opinions to wade through. And so I've tried to put together some of the best observations from the scriptures and from philosophers and theologians and all of those things. And just to give you an idea of what I do on a daily basis, I usually am doing this kind of thing. So I just write code and make web tools. I've recently taken over as DTS's Executive Director of Communications, so I'll be doing a little bit more overall communications. But I still do a lot of projects, like this is our online ed interface for Chinese students. And this is a tool called Best Commentaries, which you use to find, it's sort of like a Rotten Tomatoes for commentaries. So it takes together a bunch of reviews from a bunch of different authors, like John Piper and those guys. This is a project I did for our local NPR. This is, you know, Bitly, the URL shortener. So I made Bibly, which is like a Bible URL shortener for your site, so you can use that. And I'll also do pop-ups on your site if you want to have pop-ups not tied to any particular engine. So when someone clicks on a link on Bibly, it'll give them a choice of which interface they want to go to. So if they want to open up Logos or go to ESV's website or use any other one. So it's not tying them into a particular website. And then this is the basic look of some Bible software that I've been working on that runs off of an SD chip that you can hide inside of a coin. And right now there's 50,000 of them being delivered to the Olympics to be distributed to Arabic speakers so that they can take something home that they won't get in trouble for having when they go back home. So it's really fun to be involved in those kinds of different projects. And there's a lot of people doing a lot of cool things, and I get to be a tiny part of it. So that's what I do on a daily basis. But I've been noticing that, you know, sometimes it feels like it used to be maybe back before 1990 that the world was a serene and beautiful place and God and man were all in harmony. And now the world looks a lot more like this, where we are always telling God to wait, and we're busy, and we're connected to our devices. But we all are here because we know that these things have some good to them as well, although there are maybe some legitimate problems. So you'll see all these kinds of questions that come up about all the different technologies. And I work in online education, but there's even a professor at our school that kind of believes that online education is evil, and there's lots of things like that going around. All of the seminaries in the U.S. are about to change to where they're now allowed to have a fully online degree. So things are changing, and you find a lot of papers that will say things like Facebook makes you narcissistic, or Google makes you stupid, or technology X does something bad to you. And on the flip side, there are those of us who are saying, well, the church should be using some new technology, or we're behind in a particular area. So you've got these kind of competing messages going on between saying that technology has these problems and then saying that we need to be using them. And we've got Marshall McLuhan back in the 60s saying that if we think about media purely in terms of just how it's used, then we're kind of being a technological idiot. If all we do is think about using it for good and not for bad, that's not a very helpful stance. But on the other hand, a lot of people are saying that it's not the devil that made me do it, it's that technology made me do it, and that becomes the common excuse today for little babies like that baby who would say those kinds of things. And so what I wanted to do is to develop some ways of talking about technology that are more than just biblical in the sense of pulling out little individual verses, but looking at the Bible as a whole and how it fits together. So I put together kind of 5 big observations that we can have about the way that technology operates. And the first one is that, believe it or not, technology actually plays a decent-sized role in the story that's told in the Bible. And this is the way I like to start it out, is to think about, you know, God's original command to Adam and Eve is that they're going to be there to cultivate this earth, to do something with the garden. And that act of cultivating is always going to be, you know, using some kind of tool and taking something that God made and turning it into something else. So when God is putting them in the garden, there's nothing wrong with the garden. And yet at the same time, they're called to do something with it, to make something out of it. And so sometimes this is called the culture mandate or the creation mandate. But even God, you know, the very first verb that's applied to him is that he's a creator. And so something in that image of God, whether it's language or relationship or rationality, some part of that image of God is him as creator and us as being creators and using tools and making things. So this is our, you know, original call. And we even see that those tools that we make then they'll begin to shape us and shape the way that we view the world. And we see this even before the fall. So you guys remember what was the first thing that God asked Adam to do? Name the animals, right? So I've put up 2 animals here. What's the one on the left? The woodpecker, right? What's the one on the right? a blue jay. So notice how those terms themselves kind of shape the identity of that animal. So one of them is in the terms of what it does. That's a woodpecker. The other one is in terms of how it looks. So even words themselves and the labels that we apply to things begin to sort of become a lens that shapes the way that we see people. So we think of language as this neutral instrument of information transfer, and yet even before the fall, we see it as a shaping thing. Now, we don't know what Adam, of course, called the animals, but in naming, we're actually doing something to that thing. And this is happening before the fall. And of course, eventually, the fall comes along, and Adam and Eve introduced sin into the world, and Steve Jobs chose that symbol as kind of the enduring symbol of his own company. But if you guys remember, right after the fall, what's Adam and Eve's first response after they sin?
Adam was like, well, she...
But before the blaming, before they ever talked to God, what did they do? Before they talked to God, what's that? They hid, and then they got into an act of creation. So they decided to make something. And we've all heard the theological part about this, that this is a sort of a prefiguring of man's attempt to cover his own sin, and then God then coming along and doing something that's sacrificial for that. But there's a lot of deep symbolism going on here, in that the very first thing that someone does after they sin is to engage in an act of making, and to engage in an act of creation, and that creation is in some sense a tool that's used to overcome an effect of the fall. And if we think about our technology and our tools, many of them are oriented in that direction of overcoming an effect of the fall, whether it's an epidural or a pillow. All of those things are in some ways overcoming that. Now, not everything that we make is like that. Like a telescope is a really incredible way of just exploring God's creation, but much of the tools that we create are there to overcome the fall. Now, what's interesting, though, is to think about God's response to this. Does he sort of condemn them for trying to make something like this? What does he do? Yeah, and then what does he do specifically in response to what they made?
He makes it better.
Yeah, so he gives them the world's first free tech upgrade, right? He gives them something better. He validates their act of making and shows them how to do something better. And so there, from the very beginning, we're only a few chapters into the Bible, but even in this creation and fall, we're able to start seeing some of the meaning behind the things we make and the tools that we use. So after the fall, though, we begin to see God's plan of redemption even starts to have some little elements of technology in it. And so, we know Cain killed his brother Abel, but we see right away that what Cain does is he goes off and he creates this city. And Jacques Ellul is a theologian from Europe that would say that the city all the way through Scripture is constantly this place of condemnation. So even Jesus, when he sometimes blesses people, he sometimes curses people, but he always has curses for the city. And so what the city becomes to represent is man's attempt to sort of amass tools and things around himself so that he doesn't need to have God. So that we create an insulated life where we have no dependence on him. And so we don't need to ask him for anything, but we have it all there. And so what Cain has essentially done is set up this kind of anti-garden, where in the garden, man was dependent on his relationship with God and was with deep intimacy with him. But in the city, he can be apart from God, and he can use technology in a way that insulates him from that. And yet, God seems to allow all of our kind of culture and technology and creation to still flourish there. So even though the city theologically represents this place where God and man are separate or in some kind of disunity, this is still a place where God's grace is operating, and that it's allowing these things to come out.
And also in Scripture, there is the contrary-wise, there's the heavenly city.
Yeah. And we'll start talking about that as well. So that place of man's rejection of God becomes the place where God redeems his creation as well. So we go along a little bit further on into the story, and we see there's a couple of other interesting places where technology shows up. So a couple weeks ago, I got to go to Dubai and to the world's tallest building. And I didn't climb on the outside like Tom Cruise did, but I did stand down there and look at it. So, but remember that story of the Tower of Babel, where language becomes a tool that humanity is using in order to, again, insulate themselves from God. And so God kind of does like a language hack on them, right? And messes with them in order to reorient the social network that they've created around this object. So you start to see that incredible power of of social networks built around technology, and then God using some kind of other disruptive technology to mess it up. And the same thing strangely happens in the ark. I mean, we all know that God is perfectly capable of just like levitating Noah and some animals for a while he wipes things out. We know he did that with Moses. He's able to part the waters. And yet for some reason, you look in Genesis and you look at those first couple of chapters, and every story is very taut. It's short. It doesn't give a lot of extra description. And you see like this whole, almost half a chapter on like a technical description of how to build a boat. It's just kind of weird for that to be there. And yet it seems like God is saying, you know, not just humanity, but also human creations are going to play some part in this bigger story of God redeeming the world. And of course, there's the portrait of a righteous man on a thing of wood with destruction around him, offering some kind of salvation, and yet it not really working.
Just interesting observation there. That connects with, in Ezekiel, the description of the temple. In the later chapters, it's like, what in the world is this going on? Why is that there? It's interesting that the same sort of thing is...
Yeah, there's so much there given to physical things and what they mean and the role that they play in our relationship with God and with creation. Yeah, all the way through. And you know, as we go along throughout the whole Old Testament, you know, we see that God had given Israel, as they come out of Egypt, a whole set of laws and a whole set of language and images and practices, but all of those things are made to represent something. So everything that they did, from the stones on the priest's garb to the way that the temple is constructed, those aren't just there for convenience. They're not just there for important things like usability. They're also there because they have meaning to them. And so they all end up reinforcing the laws that Israel had. Nothing is there just because it would be useful. They're all there because they actually mean something. And the primary one where we see this is actually in the two tablets that had the 10 Commandments. You guys remember that? So this is the very first commandment, have no other gods before me. What's the second commandment? No graven images. You know, all of the commandments have this like thing that you're supposed to do or not do. And strangely there, the second commandment though is essentially about our technology and what we use to worship. Because we all believe that we can worship God anywhere, right? In that chapel, in this room, before a meal, after a meal, in the shower, anywhere we can worship God, and we can kind of worship Him however, right? But here's this restriction about what kinds of objects we can use to worship God. Why do you think this law is important? Like, why couldn't they just have a sanctioned Yahweh doll that they worshiped? Why not? Why not do that?
People would put the importance on that instead of God.
Yeah, or on that thing. And how does that specifically relate to number one? Yeah, so if you think about, you know, Israel being, you know, coming from, the Israelites coming from Egypt, and they have this sort of pantheon of gods and symbols and sphinxes and all of that, and going into the Sumerian world where there's, again, a whole tons of different gods, then to make another image of God, to make a sanctioned Yahweh statue, would then to have reinforced the point that Yahweh was among other gods. So by making a technological law, it reinforces the theological proposition at the beginning. So what God is doing here in the first two commandments is saying that your theology of media should reinforce your theology. The way that you interact with your technology, your media, should reinforce that. So this is built into, right away you get into the first two commandments and you start to see the importance of the way that we treat media in our worship. And we move on to Jesus coming. And we all know the bumper sticker that says, "My boss was a Jewish carpenter," right? Does anybody know what the Greek word behind that is? The Greek word behind that is actually the word tekton. I've got techne up here. Techne is the Greek term that means technology. Tekton is a technology worker. And so we think that the kind of technology worker that Jesus was a woodworker, just because that's been kind of the church's tradition for a while. Some people think he might have been a stonemason too. But the basic idea was that someone with tech was someone who was an artisan or creator of some kind. So it's kind of fascinating to me that when Jesus would come on earth to be this fully God, fully man thing, that he would take on this role of a maker and of a creator. And so that at the beginning of John, when it talks about that Jesus came to his own, but his own rejected him, that the God of the universe, that through whom all things were made, that the things that made him rejected him. And then we've got Jesus who is making things out of wood, and that very thing is made to kill him. So the object, the tools with which he worked were the tools on which he died. And so there at the centerpiece of our story is a symbol of the creation rejecting the Creator. So what Jesus worked with killed him, both people and the actual creations there. And yet somehow Jesus is able to transform this into the symbol that we wear around our necks and that we have on top of our buildings and that we have in the backgrounds of our PowerPoint slides, that he takes this thing and he makes it into something new. And does the same thing with a tomb as well. So then we come to this. You guys have all seen this, right? This is from a movie called Dogma a couple years back. This is Buddy Jesus. And so tell me, what does this say theologically, this thing's existence?
Chipper means probably Roman Catholic.
Maybe it comes from Roman Catholic origin, yeah. What does it mean that this exists, though? So let's think a little bit deeper. There's all kinds of profane things about Jesus, right? That are, you know, in any New York art gallery, you'll find some profane thing about Jesus. The fact that this thing exists, so from 500 AD to about 900 AD, there was a huge debate in the church about whether or not it was okay to have images of Jesus, because they would say, is that a graven image? Does that deny the second commandment? Can we make it, and can this be a way of us seeing God? So eventually they sort of said yes. Why did they say yes? Why did they say it was okay to do that? Yeah, so anytime you make a physical representation of Jesus, you are sort of reenacting the theology of the incarnation. No matter how profane it is, you can't get away from the fact that God became man. You cannot not say that, except if you don't make anything at all. And so this is the power of this object of media. No matter how bad it is, it still theologically says that God became a man. And so that theology is present in this physical thing. So this basically just says that the incarnation happened. And if we get toward the end of the story of the Bible, this is where what you were talking comes in, is that the end of Revelation begins to picture this holy city coming down. And Hebrews talks about a heavenly city. But all of these things, they talk about roads and trumpets and banners and buildings and physical things that people make as being a part of what happens in the end. So instead of us going back to a pristine garden, by the end, we are ending up at going on this journey from the garden to the city is the way that the scriptures tell it. They don't have us going back, they have us going forward. And what it means is that, you know, we all know that God is going to redeem our souls and is in the process of doing that, of sanctifying us, of bringing us into conformity with His Son. But we also know that God is going to redeem human bodies. You know, I think I grew up with that image of heaven, of being up in the clouds and playing a harp, and I thought it sounded pretty horrible, right? But, you know, I think there's been a good renewed emphasis on the physicality of the eschaton in the future. And yet also this idea that God wants to redeem the human works as well. And that's something that we probably miss to some extent, that the things that we create are things that God wants to fulfill and fix. And that's why I wrote the book called From the Garden to the City. That's sort of what this is about, of putting these things together in a way that we can talk about media through this lens of the biblical story and what it says. And we get little interesting portraits here that help us say that, you know, we're not going to be disembodied in the clouds. We're going to be physically present here on earth. And it's not about serene landscapes. So sometimes when we talk about restoring the world, we want it to go back to be like bubbling brooks and waterfalls, and we contrast that with city slums. But in reality, the portrait that God gives us is of a city that's been redeemed, not of going out to just absolute pure nature where we don't have clothing or any things that humans make. So there's actually like a little bit of a tension there between that nature and creation and what's going on there. But we shouldn't picture just an empty landscape in the future. And we also shouldn't picture this idea of removing technology, but instead that God's actions will be toward redeeming technology and creation. And we see that even in passages like this in Isaiah, where he's talking about actually transforming physical things from their destructive form to some other positive one. And of course, we don't know how literally to take a passage like this, but they do seem to portray something other than just a move from war to justice in a metaphorical sense, but also in a very physical, real sense, that all of creation, including what God made and what we make, is reconformed into the image of God's Son, into something that is useful and beautiful. And so this is our image, I think, that we should have with technology. The only other little fun, like, empty verse I just want to share with you just for a second that's there in the scriptures that talks a little bit about, as much as I've given value to technology, there's a little place where John says that in his 2nd and 3rd John, this appears, where he says, I have a lot I want to write to you, but there's some things that I don't want to use the technology of my day, which is pen and ink, to do. And instead, what I'd rather do is come and be with you face to face, because there my joy is complete or is full. And so I think even the scriptures make these distinctions between, the valid and good use of technology to accomplish things, to literally create the words of God that we now hold as holy, but also to contrast that sometimes with the fullness of the human experience that we see face to face. So I think I see in this passage a valuing of both things and a recognition of when one is right over the other. So it's not sort of an either-or proposition, but it's saying when are both useful there. So that, I think, gives us a view into the scriptures. We want to stop for any other questions before we go on and look at anything else? Well, let's keep on going. I think the other thing, though, that we need to think about is how technology's primary role is as a transformer. It's something that it does something to the world, but it also does something to us at the same time. So you often hear the idea, let's say a tool like a shovel, that shovel is essentially neutral. It doesn't have any real value in it, but that we can do something like we can do good things with it or we can do bad things with it. So we can build churches or we can axe murder. One of those two things are ways that we can use this neutral instrument that really doesn't have any value in and of itself. But if we really think about what happens, so let's imagine that we have our shovel and we decide to go and transform the world with it. We build a hole, or we dig a hole, and now we have changed the world. Well, after you've dug a bunch of holes, what happens to you? You're tired? What happens to your hands? Yeah, they get calluses. What happens to your kind of like thin arms if you did it a lot, right? Your back would get stronger and bigger. And so as you're using the tool to transform the world, it is also transforming you as well. So there's always this equation between us and the world where the tool sits there and it operates in some sense on both. It transforms both of them. And so this is true of any kind of tool. So if we fast forward to the 1st generation iPhone, then I should update my slide to be a newer iPhone. But we can all think of good things that you can do with an iPhone, or we can think of bad things that you can do with an iPhone. And that's certainly an important thing for us to be thinking about how to use these things for God's glory and not against it. But let's think about some other transformative effects. When I was a kid, I knew probably, 24 telephone numbers. Could call friends. Most of them were pizza places because I was kind of a dork, but I did know a bunch of numbers. How many do you guess I know now? 3, right? How many people in here know more than 5 numbers? Top of their heads. You know more than 5? Anybody else? Probably not a lot of us know more than a few, right? A handful of numbers. So in some sense, our mind is now, put onto that device, and that can be really helpful and free us up for other things. But some people would say that maybe now that we don't have these mundane things memorized as often, that it becomes harder for us to memorize important things because we don't want to store those things in our minds. At the same time, we all know that constant accessibility in some way can transform our workspace, our way of life, our flows, how we spend time. All those things are transformed by the presence of that device. So I think that when we're thinking about, and when we're talking about technology with people, it is wonderful to distinguish good and bad things. But I think thinking about these other transformative things is also really, really important for us. And one really famous way of saying this is to think of technology as always some extension of us as a human. So this is Marshall McLuhan's language to say that technology is an extension, so that if we were to say a telescope, what does that extend? Our eye, right? But at the same time, there is the sense that technology can be an amputation of us at the same time. So the thing which it extends is the thing which it also kind of weakens at the same time. So just to give you an example, microphones extend our... All right. Now, how many of us can speak to 5,000 people and be heard? Nobody, right? We don't cultivate that skill because we don't need to. So the technology extends our range, and yet then it takes away the need for us to develop a vocal range that can speak to a lot of people. So this isn't morally good or morally bad. It definitely, though, is transformative. And so in that sense, not really neutral. And you can see this everywhere. We can see that this is the VP of product at Facebook, and he's saying Facebook solved a problem and created a problem of having all your friends in one place. And technology is always doing this to the way that our lives go. And so I like to think about it this way. One of the ways that you can think of technology as working is that you can think of things in terms of good and bad, and that's a really helpful category, because those are the intentional things that we do. We intentionally do good things or intentionally do bad things with technology. But there's this other layer of the unintentional, of unintentionally positive, unintentionally negative things that occur when we begin to use technology. That happens at the level of society and culture. It happens in our own lives. So, if we play this game with the shovel, the good thing was building a church, the bad thing was axe murdering. The sort of bad thing we might think of as blisters and calluses, and the good thing might be big muscles and a knowledge of the soil. So in some sense, something is happening to us as we use a technology that's transformative. And I did a little experiment when it comes to reading and the way that we read. You guys familiar with TechCrunch.com? A couple of years ago, this is probably out of date now, but I kind of ran a little script to count how many words they published on all their blog posts in a given year. At the time, it was 1.8 million words in a year. You have any idea what kind of scale that is? Like how many words that is? Here you go. All those books are fewer words than TechCrunch does in a year. So, if that's just one blog that you're sort of reading, then you're out reading all of those other books. So you think that's what's happening? People are really reading all of those words on TechCrunch and not all of those words? Yeah. No. What do we do when we go to TechCrunch or any blog like that? What do? We scan, right? So our habits of reading have been changed. It doesn't really matter the content. I mean, these are the greatest works of Western literature that exist, right? They're certainly like better in content. They're more gooder than what's going on TechCrunch. But it doesn't really matter the content. It's about the medium and what it's doing to the way that we read. And so these are the things that we want to be aware of when we talk about media, so that we're not just talking always about moral uses or immoral uses. Now, let me go back. We'll talk about this for a second, but we can send you these things. This is a little, now, positive side. I've just given you a negative one. This is the online education player that I put together for DTS. So it's got your, talking head video professor. It has a transcript of the lecture and then his slides and going on there, and then we'll translate it to various languages. One of the fun things has been to see that students who aren't particularly good at listening to a lecture and just getting all of that, so there's that type A academic person that is that way, but a lot of other people don't necessarily learn really well in that format. And those students love the online format because they'll go back and they'll read the lecture 4 or 5 times, they'll go backward. Then all of a sudden we had this little influx of hearing impaired students because they did so well with this. Whereas myself, I love being in a classroom. I can't stand online education. I just don't like it at all because I'd rather be in a classroom. So I made the thing that I don't like, but it's turned out to be helpful for a different kind of learner. And it was kind of an accident. So I don't always mean to say that the accidents are always bad. There oftentimes can be really neat things. So what do we do with a statement like this? We've talked a lot about technologies transforming you. How do we evaluate this statement? What do you guys think? Facebook makes you narcissistic. What do you think?
I would say it gives you more opportunity to express your narcissism than was already there.
Ah, that's a great way of putting it, yeah. This is a portrait of Narcissus, the legend of Narcissus, where he was cursed to look at himself for the rest of his life. Yeah.
I think it would be a fine statement if you had a can in front of the name.
Yeah.
Or can make you narcissistic. It can give you an opportunity to express your current state of narcissism, but it can continue to build on that narcissism, or it could help you diminish your narcissism.
Yeah. And I think I'll just give you a little bit of language to talk about that. So, a tool like a microphone gives us this ability to reach the world that we've talked about a little bit. And if we were to use McLuhan's idea, the microphone is extending this natural function of our mouth and our vocal cords. Now, can you think of anybody in the Bible who talked about our mouth, tongue? Anything to say? James has to say, so James in Proverbs, James would say that the tongue is like a rudder and it's like a fire and we can use it for good or use it for bad. We praise God and we curse men with it. And then Jesus also had to say that what comes out of the mouth comes from, it comes from technology, right? The things that come out of the mouth come from technology. That's what Jesus said. No, he says it comes from the heart, right? So everything that's coming out of the mouth and everything that's connecting to that technology is really coming down at the basic level from the heart. And so this broken thing is the sort of root problem. And this doesn't actually make you do anything, the technology, the microphone. But it certainly does allow you to do more of it. It definitely allows the fire to become a flamethrower, to use James's language. But the way I think that some scholars would talk about these things is that technology affords certain actions that you might not be able to do otherwise, and also draws out certain characteristics in a lot of the ways that you guys have talked about things. And one way to think about these kinds of affinities is to think about other areas of our lives that maybe do this, where if you have a particular affinity for gambling, let's say, then that's going to come out differently when you're in a casino versus when you're just at home. Or the same thing with any kind of substance addiction might come out at a bar or at a party with friends. The same thing with any of our sensual or sexual addictions would come out with access to. So it seems like a lot of the issue of pornography, it has to do with access. That just by having a device in our homes that allows us to have constant access and not just be able to go down the street, that changes things a whole lot. And all of these things. So when it comes to the self-focus, Facebook gives us that ability to do that. And so when we think about a device like a phone, what is the phone like extending, to use McLuhanish language?
Conversation.
Or what kind of like natural, conversation. We could say like our mind, we could say our eyes, we could say our mouth, we could say all kinds of things. And I think this is where, the language of idolatry that we apply to technology sometimes, we say that it's an idol, that I almost worship it. I think that's definitely true, that we probably sometimes spend time idolizing our phone or whatever the device is. But I think probably the more dangerous thing is that in a broader theological sense in the scriptures, that idolatry stands for anything that you kind of place as higher or as an alternative to God, or some reason not to interact or depend upon Him. And so I think that the more of our natural humanity that a particular technology extends or interacts with, the more of us it has the capacity to sort of control, and the more of our heart it has the capacity to pull on. So when we use the kind of McLuhan, James, and Jesus' language all together, you can see why these devices can be particularly powerful. And the more humanity that a device extends, the more powerful its pull is on us. And so if you want to be at a cool dinner party and someone says, "Where do you think technology is going?" It seems as though the general trajectory is of kind of more and more human-like things, no matter what they are. They're always extending more and more of us and replacing more of those things. And so that gets deeper and deeper into those heart problems that we have. And this is why, filters at this level are super helpful. That's really a nice thing to do on technology. But to be able to have really God's Spirit work at this level is the one way that pushes it out the other direction. So I think we need to have those safeguards over there, but to always have a focus on at the deep level, all of these things that are coming out are coming from our heart. And so something that becomes more and more powerful because it connects to more and more of ourself. That language of self we find, in Paul's language, talking about sort of spirit versus flesh. And theologically, again, flesh isn't just referring to our physicality, but it's referring to that sort of inward turn of the soul. To use Augustine's language of the incurvature of the soul, it's self-directedness. That the more powerful a technology comes to replicate us, our incurvature of the soul becomes sharper and sharper and sharper. So that's sort of the way to use Pauline language of the flesh and its self-focusedness, and to pit it against the Spirit, and to say that technology is going to afford more of that, that's going to allow us to have more self-focus, is going to be put in distinction from the Spirit. And so I think that when we talk about our technology, we want to talk in biblical language about these things. Notice, I think in the NIV, it had that sin nature language for flesh a lot of times, but I think a lot of the newer versions have pushed that back out to get back to the theology of what it means to have a flesh, that good part of the physicality, but also its inward turn. So that gives us a little bit of like an understanding of how technology operates, how it works with us. And then once we have that grounding of technology's value in the biblical story and how it operates on us, that allows us to start talking about some additional things about how mediums work. So next thing we want to talk about is a little bit about these mediums and what kind of meaning they have. Now, this slide, if I showed this at the beginning, what would your opinion of my slide-making abilities be?
I would actually appreciate you.
You appreciate it.
Yes, anybody that could use common sense,
Yeah, Comic Sans. Now, I'll ask you this question. Do the words there, do they match the color and the fonts? Are the words true based on what you see there?
No.
Do the message and the medium match? No, they're in conflict, right? So the medium itself is communicating something apart from the words. And this is true really of any medium. This medium of this slide and these colors and these fonts, it communicates something under the hood. So we all say that. We say that 90% of communication is tone of voice, is what you're wearing, is how you sound, your race, your gender. All those things play into the kinds of messages that people receive that go against maybe what someone is actually saying. So again, here, the medium and the message seem to be in conflict. They don't seem to be synchronous in a way that matches. This guy is saying one thing with his words, and yet his whole demeanor seems to be saying something else. So again, what our mom said about our tone of voice and all of those things is true. Now think about that in the sense of technology. So when two people are communicating, there's more than just these words going on here. I've drawn nondescript people. But when those people are actually hearing, they're gonna know the difference between someone saying flippantly, I love you, or someone actually heartfelt saying, or I love you. All those different emphases matter. Now, your tone of voice, your age, your race, your clothing, all of those things are gonna matter for the way the message that someone actually hears. So that's all of the meta-communication theory that we all go through when we're trying to find out about speaking and how to relate. Now, when you take away all of those things and you put them here in some other device, then what you end up essentially doing is stripping away all of these human elements. They all go away. And so what you're left with then is the priorities of the device and its characteristics. So you take away all of the things that make you human in human communication, and you end up adding all of the things that are the priorities of that device. And so what that can do possibly is all kinds of wonderful things, right? Speed and efficiency. It's super important to get a text message when there's a shooter on campus, right? You have to have that. That value is wicked important in certain cases. But in other cases, like saying I disagree, that can communicate all kinds of other things that maybe you didn't intend. I mean, how many of you guys have never, ever, ever had an email miscommunication? Has anybody never had one? No, we've all had them, right? Because there's something about various mediums that communicate something. Again, it can be very, very helpful, but there's possibilities that when we take away some of that humanity and we add back in priorities of a device, then something gets communicated that you didn't mean to. And it can happen in a way that's not necessarily what we're talking about, where it's meant to be communicated. When I was a youth pastor about 10 or 15 years ago, I really, really, really wanted to get a projector because only about half our kids had Bibles, and we had some raggedy ones to give to the other half of the kids. But I really, really wanted to get a projector so I could show the Bible. I was at a Bible church. We wanted to use the Bible. I wanted to show the Bible. So I wanted to get a projector to show the Bible. Now you guys can guess. Half the kids had Bibles before the projector. Once I started using the projector, how many people brought Bibles? None, right? It goes down. How many people open their Bibles in church? How many of you guys bring a Bible every single Sunday to church that don't have a projector? So there's a few people that maybe don't, right? Anymore. So you still, some of us still do, some of us still don't. How many times do you open it every single time? If it's projected on screen, do you still open it every single time? Yeah. Maybe some of us do, some of us still don't, but a lot of us don't. And so that's one of these interesting effects that a change in technology can do. And I really wondered for a while if I had done something horrible, if I was like the world's worst youth pastor, because I was at a Bible church and now my kids didn't bring Bibles, right? But you know, if you think about it, people have only been bringing their own personalized, individualized Bibles with their name printed on it for maybe 50, 100 years. Before that, there was a family Bible, and before that, there was no printed Bible in a home. So when you went to go hear the Word of God on a Sunday, you kind of had to memorize what you heard and let that ruminate throughout the week. And so now we have created a world in which we have personal devotional time, something that no one from Moses to Martin Luther ever had. Not a single believer for 3,000 years ever had a personal, individualized Bible study by themselves. No quiet times. Nothing that they were, now they might have still been meditating on the Word that they heard in the community, but they wouldn't do it by themselves. And then, you know, a little bit after the printing press, a couple hundred years after that, we added a technology layer on top of the Bible. And now it's the grid through which we see everything. What was that grid? What's that? Chapters and verses, right? We added that on top of the Bible, and now that's the thing that we use to see everything. We have favorite verses, and now not everybody knows what that means. So when somebody puts John 3:16 on their football thing, then Google searches go up for John 3:16 because people don't know what that code means anymore in our broader culture. But as much as, study Bibles are helpful and verses are helpful, I write Bible software, I really appreciate the versification system. It also changes the way that we encounter the scriptures. So when we think about something like a projector, we've got the obvious good things like showing the scriptures, but we have bad things that we might not want to do in a youth group. But we also have these unintentional things like maybe not having as much personal Bible reading, but maybe we have a good thing and that we're restoring that sense of reading the Bible as a community. Instead of having 30 translations and custom covers and the women's pink Bible and the men's camouflage Bible, now we're all sharing the same Bible again in some interesting way. So there's these changes that happen that aren't always just in terms of good or bad or intentional or unintentional. There's all kinds of things happening. So then when we look at something like this on Facebook and we say, that's got to mean something. The ability to craft a profile, the ability to say, let me change my picture and show who I am, and our identity becomes tied up in that thing. So that sometimes we end up losing some of the point of why we have technology. And I think one really easy way to think about it is that whether it's paper, like John was writing, or a computer, or a phone, or Facebook, if we can think about technology as in some way helping us and directing us toward the table and toward fellowship with others, and augmenting that and helping that can help us think about the ways that we would be using these tools. If they're directed in that sense that it augments and helps the table, then that's, I think, a really helpful thing. If it becomes a replacement for it so that when we come around to the table and we're supposed to be having communion, but something gets in the way, that's probably a more negative use of technology because it's affecting that and it's communicating something. When you stick a phone on the table, it seems to change sort of the meaning of that room. So even if you don't actually use it, but you just put it out, it says something about the kind of interaction that you're going to have. It says something about who's important and what's going to have access to this shared space. So when we think about it doesn't really matter what we say on the cell phone or who we call or whether we do a bomb threat or call in something for a church. What does matter is that phone is there and that disrupts and changes that environment. And so this is, again, about mediums are communicating meaning all the time in everything that we do. And the other thing that they're really capable of doing is shaping the way that we think. So we talked a little bit about the numbers of reading and the way that we think. One of the ways that you see this is just even in common advertising. So Jeep is making this argument that all the things that we make do something to us. This is what we've been talking about. In Jeep's case, they're making the case that they make an awesome car, and if you buy the awesome car, you will then become awesome, right? That's the argument, is that whatever tool you use, you become like that tool. But in some sense, they're a little bit right in that, if I use a treadmill every day, my shape's going to be different. And if I read for a couple hours every day, my ability to read is going to go different. And if I read a long-form novel by Dostoevsky or a lot of tweets, I'm going to change my abilities based on those things. If I do a lot of squats, my legs are going to be one shape. And if I do a lot of running, my legs are going to be another shape. So if that's true of us physically, it would seem that it should also be true of the way that we think. And if we look at some of the big cultural movements, this is the way that, this is a very simplified model. If you read media culture or media ecology, they'll often give these kind of major movements and sometimes break them up differently. In reality, it's far more complex than this. It's always overlapping. It's different in different regions, but this gives us some idea. But if we go back to an oral world where there is no writing, so there was some time before there was paper and ink and alphabets and even cave drawings. And in that time, every piece of knowledge in human existence was stored in somebody's head. So minds were the hard drives of humanity at that time. So if you wanted to know something, you would have to go to a person to get it. There is no Wikipedia or Britannica or anything like that. So if you wanted to go know the most accurate information, who are you going to go talk to? The youngest person in the room? No, you're going to go talk to the oldest person in the room because he's the person that has the biggest hard drive. It's full of the most stuff. And it's also had time to ruminate, time to figure it out, time to turn knowledge into wisdom. So naturally, the oldest person is the leader of that society, just by virtue of the way information works in that world. So when we zoom ahead to the written world, then the leader now becomes the learned man. It becomes the man who is able to encode thoughts onto a page and then decode those thoughts. So in a funny way, we see this transition between Moses and Joshua. So Moses and Joshua are both kind of righteous men, right? They're qualified for leadership. But Moses was a much older man and Joshua was a much younger man. And the difference in some sense there is that Joshua is able to read the words of God, and he has them. And so now a young man who's godly can become a leader. And this changes the equation here that a learned man can become a leader in that group. But that does disrupt the way that we interact and the way that we see people. And you can tell, as we go more and more forward, the older person is less and less valued because their knowledge now seems out of date instead of up to date. And so that technology is shaping the way that we think and also the way that we interact with other people. If we fast forward to the print era, the world was a little bit different there in that they were ruled with guys that had hats, right? So the popes and the kings were the people that ruled society because they had access to information. Information was expensive, books were expensive, and so the people who held the information held that power. And so, of course, along comes Johannes Gutenberg, and he gives everybody the ability to have a book. And so what that does is, not only does it take this tightly knit group of people and separates them out, because if you're going to go read, you have to go do it in a corner. Reading is an activity that we do in isolation, by ourselves, without a community, unless we read verbally outside. Usually when we read a book, we're doing it kind of in a separate way. And that separation then allows the sense of one leader, of a pope or of a king, to no longer be valid. And so we see two major moves that are kind of coexistent with the printing press. And what are those two big things? What happened to the kings? What's that?
What kings?
Yeah. So what's the movement that's counteracting? Democracy, right? So democracy would say that every individual comes and has an equal say. And that's because every individual, in some sense, has equal access to information. So we don't need an expert anymore in that sense. And so what did it do to the Pope? So we don't need someone who holds that information over us. We now all have that. And so, concepts like the priesthood of all believers, Martin Luther translating the Bible into common vernacular is had a big effect. Now, of course, it would be way too simple to say that the printing press did all of these things. So that's not what we're saying. But we are saying that this is going along with these movements in society. And so if we look again toward our current world, we see some shifts, but I want to point out one other thing. The other thing that people often attribute to this time period is the concept of an individual being a big thing. And before that, you often had a much more tight-knit sense of existence. And I'll point it out in one particular verse that always confuses me. In Acts where it constantly says, "You will be saved, you and your household," I have no idea what that means. It is utterly incomprehensible to me. All I understand is how I individually get saved. I just don't get it. I don't know how a household could get saved in that sense. I think in a people that are less individualized, that probably makes some kind of more sense than it does to us. And the way that we think of salvation is a little bit more about something that happens to the individual and less of something that happens to the community. It's hard for us to even think of in that category without feeling it's almost heretical to talk about salvation and community tied together. We always think about it in terms of the individual, and we start to see that evolving in this era. So if we move ahead, there's all kinds of developments through the Industrial Revolution. Suburbs are created, people living further apart, they have cars, the car gives you independence and freedom, all those kinds of things. But at the same time, a new technology of images are built, and there's something really interesting about images, and I want to tell you about it. Here's a sentence. Would you tell me how you feel about that proposition?
I agree.
You agree? Nice. But, it's a proposition. It tells us some data about that. Now, contrast that with this one. Yeah, you kind of felt something, right? You laughed. How about this one? You feel something very different. It's sort of the same data, but the image does something very different to us than the data does, than that sentence did. These two things do something really, really different. So with data, we sort of think first, and then we maybe feel a little bit about it. With an image, we feel first, and then we think about it later. And so the phrase is often said that, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And in reality, it's probably better to say that a picture is worth 1,000 emotions. And that emotions are the primary mode of being, of existing, that images do. And I think some guys have been talking about moving to an image-based culture, and I think we see this everywhere. In that these pictures have such a powerful way of making us want to buy certain products. The entire advertising industry is built around the idea of images and emotions. The whole issue of pornography is really, really powerful sexually and all of that, but it's also very powerful in that these pictures make us want to jump into the story. We want to know what's going on in these things. They're not abstract like language is. These are very concrete things. I really want to know what happened to those people over there. And I think that's what happens to some sense in all pictures. We want to know what happened. We want to know something more about that. It pulls us in a way that's very deep. And any image, whether it's funny or sad or sexual, all of those things do something to us. And they're operating at very deep levels within us. So this move to a more image-based culture is part of this whole world of the internet and people being reconnected with technology. And I think this is where that phrase, the medium is the message, comes up. That it really does matter what we transmit over what data we put across our lines, that we have good biblical content on websites and not bad content. But in some other sense, the medium itself and its presence, the internet, is a shaping power, that medium becomes the message in the way that it reshapes the way that we shop, the way that we do business, the way that we have friendships. And so Shane Hibbs put this little thing together to say that back in the oral era, we would be all very tribal. We'd be very empathetic to the people around us. If you live in a small community of 200 people, you know when someone has a baby. You know when someone has a new birth. You know when someone's sick. And you know all those things about them. It's a very intimate world. And the sort of print and post-industrial world, there's very much a sense of the individual. You're distant. You find out about information that happens somewhere else, but it's not something that's happening close to you. You have the ability to be anonymous. If you've ever written something on the internet that someone that you don't know has read, you have been anonymous at some point. Even if you write a book, it's something that someone has now access to my thoughts by going and buying a book, and they can get something anonymously into me. But when we get to the digital world, we re-function as tribes, but we're also very individualistic. I mean, we form groups online, but we also have our own profiles. We see tsunamis. We see people dying all the time, and we feel sad for them, and we click like, but it's always at a distance in some way. So it becomes a difficult proposition for us as believers to create something more than just feeling sad for a few seconds because of a picture. And the same thing with this, where we see all kinds of anonymous intimacy. Did you guys see AirPlay was released yesterday? The guys that made Napster released a kind of a chat roulette style thing through Facebook, where you find people that share common interests and you can chat with them through a new interface. And they had all kinds of celebrities, and Jimmy Fallon, all those people were all there for the big launch. But it's this way to have intimacy through a weird kind of anonymity at the same time. And sometimes that can be really useful, right? Like Alcoholics Anonymous is powerful precisely because of its anonymity. So sometimes that's a good thing. I don't mean to purely paint this whole right column as extremely bad, but you see some of these broad movements. Again, this is radically simplistic, but it does help you see some of what's going on culturally. So when we talk about a social network, there's all kinds of great things that we can do with it. There's all kinds of bad things that we can do with it. But I think what's helpful for us to be discussing with people is some of the unintentional things that you might not have known that someone needed prayer, and now you have a way of knowing about that. Or you may, when you meet with your small group, if you keep up with them on Facebook, now you don't have to go through all of the particulars of a person's day. You know some of that, and now you can just ask them about that because you don't get to see them as often. And that's a really neat unintentional thing that can happen if you spend some time on there. And then we have all the unintentionally bad things that can happen when someone is unreflectively using these particular tools. So talking about both of these layers, both the intentional and the unintentional, and moving some of these unintentional things up to that level of intentionality is one of the ways I think we want to go. but everyone is dealing with this. I mean, this is the CEO of Google. He's worried about the way that things are going. He's worried about, and his job is to catalog all the world's information, and yet he is also worried about how things are going and the intentionality or non-intentionality of it. But even just if you think a little bit about the way that you're going to use a particular medium, like you may notice right now, that I haven't read the slide up there, that I've been talking about it as you read it and I bolded certain words. That's kind of an interesting, different way of using the medium of the slide, and that I'm using it for you guys to be able to see it, but not to just sit up here and read it. So thinking about the way that someone would interact with it, I want you to read his words. I don't want to read them to you. So just being intentional about the way that you use media, even in a setting like this, can be very, very helpful. So we've talked a little bit about technology doing things to us and our intentionality. How do you guys feel about who's in control at this point? Is it technology or is it people? Depends on the person? Okay. Like in a broad sort of like theoretical sense. Starting to lean that way. Anybody else want to push back? This way, that way?
I'd say it's the people.
It's the people?
Until the technology can create people.
Okay.
People create the technology that enables the technology to control people.
And we certainly, I think, in this room, we're all being very intentional. And I think we understand that we have some ability to do that. At sort of the larger, like, cultural level of the way things go, in philosophy of technology terms, instrumentalism is usually the word that's used to talk about where, hey, the technology is sort of just neutral. We can use it for whatever we want as long as we're using it for good and not for bad. It's a helpful thing. That's really on that end that people always have control over what they're doing. The determinism side is the one that's saying that technology makes you something. That's, whenever you see an article that says Facebook makes you narcissistic, that's going to be more on this end of things. Now, it is certainly true that, when Amazon comes out, we buy things differently, right? We have kind of configured our lives around Amazon or around iTunes. So there is some sense in which technology does shift our habits. But even within this scale, there are some determinists who are more positive about technology and some that are more negative. So the positive ones would be like the futurists or the post-humanists, or those people who are seeing technology as like our salvation, our redemption. They would retell that biblical story by kind of like plinking Jesus off the timeline and saying that our next evolutionary step is by kind of augmenting ourselves with technology, by becoming post-human. Ray Kurzweil is one of the most famous ones. He takes like 1,000 vitamins a day because he wants to get to the singularity where he can download his mind onto some kind of substrate and then become eternal. And so it's really fascinating. It's basically a religion, right? There's a savior, there's an eschatology, there's a means of it, there's a date, the singularity, the day of the Lord. All of that stuff is present in that kind of thinking. And so even sometimes, have you guys ever gotten the sense that like some of those like super happy Apple commercials almost seem like that? They're like, this is going to make your life so much better. It's almost inherent in a lot of the way we advertise. But on the other hand, the pessimism side are those who often would say that technology is the destruction of society and it's taking us down, it's making things bad, and our kids are going to become little evil people and all of that stuff, the more pessimistic side. And I think we want to be somewhere in the middle of this. In the academic world, there's these social construction of technology, social shaping of technology, all of these theories. They're trying to be somewhere in there. And then we, I think, also want to imbue this with some theological language about the role of the Spirit in this. We could be over on the other side and try to talk about whether or not we think people are clean slates or what. But somewhere in there, I think we want to be in the middle, recognizing technology's power to shape us, but also our power to decide how we're going to operate with it. So we want to be somewhere in here. And I think sometimes talking with people about how they see things can help them identify, oh, I have kind of been thinking in this area, or maybe I've been up here. I hadn't really thought about it much. So where you are on that scale. And the last thing that I want to address a little bit is we've talked about really the individual, we've talked about the church, but to talk about culture and where it's going. And the way I'm going to use the word culture is maybe a little bit different. So there's high culture and there's low culture. We all know about those kinds of uses, or we know about the music and different pop culture and all of that stuff. We know about those ways of talking about culture. The way that I'm going to use it is to use a little bit of theologian Emil Brunner's very short, succinct definition of culture, which is to take meaning and to materialize it in some way. So remember when we were talking about Israel and that God had all these laws and things that he wanted to have in very material, physical form, that the rituals that Israel went through, they all had some kind of meaning in the physical world. That's really what culture always is. And so it has these three things. There's always some meaning, and it goes down into things. And then the way that plays out is all of cultural goods. So any kind of object, whether it's a building or a podium, an image like you see on screen, a ritual, not necessarily like a formal ritual, but like, what do most of us do when we first wake up in the morning? What's the very first thing we do? Bathroom. Do you maybe look at a clock first? It's kind of a little bit of a ritual. How many of you guys check your phone first? It's kind of a ritual, isn't it? I mean, not ritual in the sense that you meant it to have value, but it is a ritual that we do. And then language itself, which we talked about way back even before the fall. These are kind of the four big categories for cultural goods. And all of them have this way of kind of giving us meaning and value and identity. And I'll give you two examples of this to talk about how powerful things can be. I grew up in a little bit of a broken home. My dad sort of joined an interesting cult group for a while, and he left her family, and my mom was left with 4 kids by herself. And sometime when I was in my 20s, I started to wonder, gosh, I seem to have turned out relatively okay. And so did my brothers and sisters, and I started to wonder, I wonder why that is. I mean, why was God so gracious to us to allow us to be that way? And so one day my mom and I were going along in a park outside of San Antonio where I grew up, and she pointed off to the side and she said, hey, I want you to see something. And I was like, I don't know. And she pointed over in this area, and I was like, I see some rocks. And she said, well, when your dad and I split up, I came out to this park one day when you guys were at school, and I just didn't know what to do. And so I built this little altar, and I began to pray for you guys every day and asking that God would protect you and would put people in your lives that would guide you and lead you to the Lord. And in that moment, I mean, I've never seen a physical object that had so much meaning, that transferred so much sort of value to me, that shaped my identity in such a way. And that's a very extreme example of the power that things have to shape us, but they all do. Even say, for example, this room, the way that it's configured, this has a meaning, doesn't it? So it means that this is a lecture, right? I'm going to talk. It means that you guys out there are learners and I'm a teacher. We all get a sense of identity from the way the room is. And we also have a value system that's built into the way the room is constructed. But if we were to go back and to rearrange these chairs, very same objects, rearrange them, they would have a different set, right? What would they mean? Yeah, it's group. What would your identity become? Yeah, it would become some kind of participant, possibly. And we would value then everyone's thoughts and not the speaker's thoughts. So everywhere around us, there are things that are put in a certain way that communicate meaning and value and identity. We saw this, Israel had that culture. Each of these things meant something. They communicated a sense of meaning and value and identity. We have these things today. That's supposed to be a baptismal. Sorry, not every one of them turned out that well. But these all mean something to us, We have embodied our theology in these things, and we still believe that these are important to do. That they teach us something, that the act of baptism and the act of regularly taking communion is something that means something to us. They give us a sense of identity. They have a value system built into them. And so, American culture, we have all kinds of things in our culture that mean something to us. So what about this thing? What does this one do? What kind of meaning and value and identity does it have? I think these are the kinds of questions that we want to explore, not in a negative sense to say that this is all bad and that, communion is all good and iPhones are all bad, but to sit down and say, gosh, really, what does this mean to me? I think the easiest way to find out what it means to you is to lose one, right? Then you find out really what it means to you and what kind of sense of identity you get from having that device. What kind of value system is embedded in it when you lose your device, or even when something like, say, food for us has meaning and value and identity, and God asks us to fast from it on occasion so that we can remember who really gives us our identity, what we really believe in, what we really value. And so if something has deep, deep meaning for us, it's probably time to occasionally fast from it to remember what it is that where we should be getting our identity and meaning and value. The one other area that I think is worth us thinking about, just for us, this is the guy that invented. Oops, sorry. Let me go back. This is the guy that invented the mouse and Windows, like the whole concept of like Windows over Windows. This is Alan Kay. And his simple definition for technology is anything that was invented after you were born. You know why that's significant, that particular definition? If you think about the way that people talk about technology, we don't talk about lights as technology, cars are not technology, running water is not technology. None of those things are technology. Only things kind of in our lifetime do we think of as technology. So to give you a big giant timeline of human history is agriculture, writing, all these different things, when they were invented. These are all the things that for us are essentially not technology to some degree. So if we were born in, say, the 50s or 60s or something like that, all of this stuff is just not technology to us. We don't think about them as technology. They're just stuff that exists. So the guy that wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Doug Adams, kind of expanded on that idea. And he would say, okay, everything before we're born is just stuff. Then he would say, everything from 0 to 30 is cool, amazing things that you can build a career on. Everything after 30 is the destruction of society and the denigration of our children. So maybe some of us that are getting closer to that age or past that age, maybe we start to realize, we start to wonder about, like, should my kid have an iPad? And we start to ask those questions about what it's going to do to them, even though we would never have questioned the role of a telephone in our own lives, right? But we would question the role of an iPad in their lives. And where this becomes particularly important is that someone who was born in a different era sees other things as not technology. And they see other things as cool that someone else sees as foreign and as offensive. And there is our conflict zone right there. This is sort of that ageism that makes us feel uncomfortable with something. It would be like if everybody in America suddenly decided that instead of shaking hands, we're going to bow. Little kids would think that was great because they don't know anything different. But some of us might feel like that was a little bit weird. And no matter how hard we tried to like bow correctly, we'd always be a little bit wooden. We would be kind of ESL bowers, right? It'd be like second language people. We could never quite do it natively because we just didn't grow up with it. And this is what happens with technology, is that if you don't grow up with it, you always use it a little bit differently than maybe someone who's native to. So the example that people often give is, when the television first came out, people would read scripts. Newscasters would read scripts just like they did on the radio. And it took a while to sort of figure out how television should be used, and it took kind of a new generation. But now the difference, you notice kind of like there's a dot like every 1,000 years back here, but now like every 1,000 seconds over here. So it creates all this rapid interrupt and rapid deculturalization where we don't have as many things that are unified that we can all attend to. But the reality is that someday that young guy is going to have new things that are going to be invented that are going to be weird and foreign to him, and maybe be a source of conflict for him, and he'll have to readjust to these things. So we're all dealing with that. But the way that we see it maybe in a family is that traditionally cultures are separated by language and skin color and that kind of thing. And so, two families with 2 kids would be separated into culture A and culture B. But today, though, if those people are a culture of one technology and these are a culture of another, then the dominant culture set is their technology usage. Because remember, all the way back to Adam, language is this extremely powerful combining force. And if technology is the extension of our language, that becomes the tool that separates or divides us. And so this kind of union is something that both like young people need to have grace for older people, and older people need to have grace for younger people to be able to come together. And I think this may be one of the unique areas that the church may actually be able to contribute to sort of wider culture by having that knowledge that they can be gracious to one another, that they can learn from one another, that we would reinstill the value of younger people learning from older and older people wanting to know from younger. And it's not always older, younger. I mean, I fully recognize that that's not the way technology always divides, but broadly speaking in our culture, this is kind of the kinds of things that are happening. So just by way of review, just to kind of go back over the things, and then we can talk for a little bit together as a group. Just to remember that technology actually is a big part of the biblical story. We don't normally think of that because, again, technology is anything that was invented after we were born. And so we don't think of things like, say, when the alphabet was invented around 1700 or so, that when Moses is writing, maybe 1500 or 1200, depending on what you think, that was like cutting edge technology at the time. That God was using that as a way of moving things from oral into being able to say, it is written, right? That move to saying it is written was really significant because writing something down costs a lot of money. So that phrase, it is written, means this is important enough to have written down. That's what that meaning was in that day. So it becomes part of even our Word of God. It becomes part of our worship and the way that the church and Israel had debated over the role of media in our services, in our worship. And even in our future, that we definitely don't think of things as going up into an ephemeral cloud world. But we don't just think of returning to a pristine garden, but that we think of God as redeeming these things that we're making. And I think that helps us to go, the things that we're making probably are always in need of redemption, of better usability, or of all kinds of different things like that. And also to think about this role of technology transforming both the world and us. But then to go back and say technology certainly can transform us, but it's also important to think about it as not making us do something, but of enabling certain new habits and new ways of doing things that can draw out characteristics. So Facebook is probably better at drawing out the flesh than, say, a piece of paper is. But it doesn't mean that it makes us narcissistic. So having language like that can sometimes be helpful. And then as we think about every medium that we use as communicating some meaning in and of itself. So from a text message to an email, and we can often go backwards so that, when we want to signify that an event is really important, what kind of clothing do we wear? New clothes? Like new styles? Do we go look in Vogue to figure out what to wear to our wedding? No. We go back and we look at old clothes because that tells us that it means something. So anytime you use something older, it can often communicate to people that it means something more to you. So when you write someone a note on a piece of paper, it magically means something to them in a way that an email or a text message doesn't. So you have this ability to think about the meaning of each medium and then to use that as appropriate. And the same thing to think about the way that we're thinking. If you want to become someone with big, strong, huge legs, then maybe one of the things that you should do is to do squats, right? And if you want to be one of the kinds of people that has long, lean legs, you should run, right? So if you want to be the kind of person who could read long-form literature, should you read Twitter all day? Maybe not, right? I'm not saying that Twitter's bad. I'm just saying that Twitter cultivates the ability to read short-form messages. That someone who reads a lot of books has a lot of trouble with Twitter. They feel overwhelmed because that medium is shaping their thinking in the same way that exercise shapes our body. And then finally, to think about technology as defining culture and separating it out in some way. This may help some of our church conflicts that we occasionally have. So just as a background, just to always remember that technology is a good gift from God. It's a deep part of being human. That Jesus himself, his humanity, was tied to the job of making things. That when the Son of God became the Son of Man, he made things, and that was part of his role. So that means that though we need to both work through and against our technology. So we need to continually work through the things that God has given us, but sometimes to work against the value systems that are built into it that may be more negative. And so that's it. That's all I have for you. If you want to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me at any of these places, and you can also buy that book if you'd like to. So, and I've got a couple here if you need one. Well, you guys have any other questions or anything before we end?
Yeah. So would you say not technology is neutral,
right,
or that is bad? It's good, but it can be used in bad ways. Regardless, it has a transformative effect.
Yeah, I think we can use it for good, we can use it for bad, but that doesn't mean that it's neutral. I think I want to just use the word transformative. If I use that word, it helps me to say it's always going to have this kind of both and effect. And because the word neutral seems to communicate that the technology is not important at all and that it doesn't matter. Because sometimes even in ministry though, we say this, we say, hey, our theology hasn't changed, but our means have. Or we say, hey, it's the same eternal word of God, but we're just putting it on a different medium. That's not exactly true, right? Because our habits are different today when we read the Bible on our phone, which is what I do, than someone who only heard the Bible orally in church. it does mean something different. It has transformed worship, and it's transformed meditation. So I want to say I don't want to use the word neutral, I want to use the word transformative, and then think through what those transformative things are. And when they're kind of more positive, when they're more negative, and maybe sometimes we need to work against the negative things. So sometimes it can be really helpful to say, there's a couple of people that produce Bibles that don't have verses or numbers in them, and it is wonderful to read one of those, because you don't have this distraction. What's that?
Really want a manuscript.
I can't exactly. I mean, one of the best things I could do would be to point you to, a tool that I developed a little while back. Well, no, this is an audio Bible that.
If you want to get back to the real Bible, you have to take out the punctuation.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yes, this Bible software that I developed. This is the one that will go on the chips. It does allow you to go into the options and turn off chapters and verses. So you could do that and sort of, you could read it that way. It still has the paragraphs though, so maybe it would be fun to pull that out as well. That I do find to be a little bit helpful, especially in a narrative passage or in a poetic passage, that the formatting does seem to help, but that allows you to do it. I know books of the Bible. Okay, BLB site, nice. So Blue Letter Bible also allows you to take out chapter and verses, or you could probably write some custom CSS if you're into that. Booksofthebible.info I know also sells a verseless, it's a verseless NIV. I don't know of anyone that sells, does anybody know if Crossway sells a verseless ESV? I don't know if they do. But that can be a way of breaking up things, to think about what is the medium doing to the way that I communicate, and what is the meaning behind that thing. So that's an important step.
There's an article a friend of mine pointed guys that we read. It's a site that I don't know much about. It's called the Art of Manliness site, but
okay.
It's the tool works on both sides, both ends, or something like that. Was the name of the article.
Okay.
And it was talking about how the tools affect us as much as we use it to affect other things.
Yeah.
And what it pointed at is one of its main examples was that we don't have as many tools anymore.
Mm-hmm.
This, or your computer, is the tool you use to do what you used to take.
Yeah.
10, 12, 50, all these other specialized tools. Now we just have this one thing, or two or three,
Yeah.
And that effect that's having on us, that on our brains, on how we learn,
Mm-hmm.
What we retain, or just even in terms of our muscles, we're using our eyes and fingers.
Mm-hmm.
And what used to take, and that does change us.
Yeah.
How it changes us.
On my computer, I had all these different Bibles and all these other study tools. And then God told me to fast on computers, which I've been doing for 3 years, 6 months, 6 days, and 8 hours. So now in Bible study, I have like 7 Bibles out, plus the Strongs and a bunch of other stuff. So I've got books all over the place. And I don't know what else is listening to these big books.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're thinking through like what else is going on here than just the presence of the text. So we know that the Word of God is eternal and unchanging, and yet the mediums do have some effect on the way and what we value and what we see. And it's not to say that one is necessarily bad, because the printed Bible is a new phenomenon. So again, 3,000 years of believers from Moses to Martin Luther didn't have a printed Bible. No one had one. No one had a favorite verse. No one had a life verse. None of that stuff. They would, if you asked Augustine what his favorite verse was, he would have no idea. So, yeah. So, but that's not to say that those things are bad. They're just to say that they are transformative, right? They're not good. They're not bad. They're not neutral. They're transformative. So.
Something that struck me when you were talking about different cultures. You're showing like the families and the ages having different cultures. It seems like kids now, or younger people I should say, you got the blogs, you got the tweets, you got all this stuff going on. They're connected all the time. It's like they're living their life very much in front of the world, whereas all those old people like me are like, no, that's private. I don't want that in the world. Yeah. So
yeah, and I think. Yeah, whenever we can observe things that are different from how we grew up, and that they often create some dissonance. And what's sometimes helpful is for us to go back one more generation. So, for example, I was reading a biography of William Wilberforce, and it talks about him wanting to go see John Wesley. And so the way that you would do it is Wilberforce would go to John Wesley's house and leave a note and say, I'm going to come call on you at 2 p.m. Hopefully Wesley is available at that point. And so that's the language of calling on, is leaving a note. So then John Wesley would know that at 2 p.m. he needs to be dressed up and ready to have this conversation. So then when the phone comes along in, say, kind of the early 1900s, the language of call changes to this direct communication that you go right in there. And so what starts to happen is there's this debate in 1910s and 1920s over what the proper etiquette is, because no longer is someone dressed up for an official call. They're now, I mean, they could be in their underwear or in anything. And so even though, should we use the language of hello or how we should greet one another and what all of that meant? So if you think about the continuum from like the old style of I'm going to call on you to the telephone call where everyone has the same call in the house. And so when you call up, you say, hey, my name is so-and-so, can I speak to Johnny? And then they would transfer the phone. There was interaction within the community of both sides. Then to direct cell phones where we have our direct ones. And at least though, if I'm gonna call Antoine, I'm gonna say, hey, and he's gonna say, hey, John, how are you doing? And we have a little chit chat at the beginning and we do at the end, where a text message takes all that out. And so there isn't that community, there isn't the greeting, and yet text messages are extremely and enormously useful for certain things. But they do modify relationally. So if you look back, you can say, hey, look, this whole formality of sitting down and having a conversation with somebody and planning it out and getting dressed for it, even way before anybody in this room was born, we started talking in a discarnate way in our underwear to each other. And so I remember when my son was like 2, he hated discarnate daddy because he never wanted to talk on the phone with me. He just couldn't stand it. Now he kind of gets it. But what's funny for him is that I've taken videos of him on an iPhone and pictures, and he doesn't get it why all the pictures are broken. Because they don't move, right? And for him, whatever he grew up with is his normal. So our house is normal, the food that we eat is normal, the kinds of technology we have is normal, and then later on when a new technology comes out, it's disruptive to our normal, in the same way that bowing would be disruptive to us. So I think going back can sometimes help put it into perspective and maybe soften it a little bit, even though taking into account there really are some real problems going on.
One story I have, a few years ago, my goddaughter, she's 3 years old now, she's only known broadband smartphone world. And she only knows, she learned Elmo first from a smartphone. And so when Godpop came to visit, if Godpop did not show Elmo on the phone, it was broken. And if it buffered, it was broken. And a broken thing to a less than 3-year-old usually requires it being thrown somewhere.
Yes. Yeah.
But one of the things that happened is my best friend and his wife, they had a problem with trying to figure out why she didn't understand why it buffered. Because while we grew up in the world, the same age, we grew up in a world of buffering.
Yeah.
You know, and near-ish instant access. But having to now go back and say, well, do you remember when you had a 28.8 or 14.4 and you waited and waited?
How about 1024?
I didn't have 1024. I wasn't allowed to touch a computer, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But you know, even then you have to make those steps of going back and saying this is her reality versus your reality. And I mean, unfortunately, Uncle Antoine taught her the iPad before she learned how to say verbal, because now that's her reality. This manipulating pixels is easier to her than manipulating cardboard and crayon.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not a wrong thing on her end. But as parents and godparents, this is something that okay, this is her reality. We kind of have to go forward to go backwards.
Yeah.
We've got to go and see things from her perspective, you know, be like a child and then some. But then also come back and say, okay, where do we have our Etch-a-Sketch moments?
Yeah.
You know, our Lego Connects moments. You know, our Radio Shack Radio Kids moments. because it was new to us, and our parents looked at us with the same eyes.
Yeah, and I don't want to overplay. There's a theological term that's way overused, but that term, incarnation or incarnational, you can see something in the person of Jesus coming down and taking on a cultural and religious and time-bound identity that maybe might not have been his favorite. Like if he could look forward, maybe he would think of something different, or look back, or that kind of language. Maybe that might not have been his favorite, but he took it all the way on and fully came in with those people, and were willing to work both through and against that particular world. And I think that's kind of what we're called to do as well. And I think even as we move from a word-based culture to an image-based culture, again, Jesus gives this fantastic model. He's the Word of God and the image of God. I think he goes toward both of those things, and that ultimately what's going on underneath the hood is that we are in need of Christ, we're in need of the gospel at a more fundamental level than we are in need for any of the rest of this stuff, is that's still the core issue that we're all called to do.
One thought, which has been interesting to think about, that in terms of the transmission of technology, so I have two older brothers, the oldest one's 6 years older than me. His kids are older than mine, but he passed technology on to them differently than I do, because he's 6 years older. Basically, that was a different era technologically, sort of.
Yeah.
So now his kids, though, so they're in high school, it's like they didn't have the same values passed on about being forward-thinking about technology, because it wasn't as important in my brother's family, because he grew up in a slightly different time.
Okay.
They're older. Now then take me, my kids, I'm passing on almost a different set of values, and there's almost, then you take the kids that are older than my brother's kids, that was when they were in high school when this stuff was first coming out, so they got a whole different experience. It was especially native, and so you get these things don't always get transmitted equally. There seem to be, like, there can be forward and backward movement based on what our parents are like and what they pass on.
Yeah, and I know in general, forward and backward makes sense, right? I mean, I think that, say, with antibiotics, there is a forward and there's a backward. And with the other ones, though, that's a deep fundamental assumption that we have right now, that there is a sense of progress, that it actually is better. And that a newer model of computer, we know that it's better because it's faster, but a deeper sense of what does better actually mean is something that we probably all should spend some time exploring. Because if we buy that idea that progress is all technological, that shapes a little bit about the way that we view things and people and our whole way of living. So, just for what it's worth.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.